My name is Carol, I'm 22 years old, and I just graduated from college. It was supposed to be the beginning of a new chapter, a time when the world would open up endless possibilities for me, but instead I returned to where I left 4 years ago, to a home that now belonged to me, but never really seemed to belong to me. This house belonged to my mother. It was her pride, her refuge, her fortress, built long before my father came into her life, and remained unchanged even after he left us. Mom was a person who always planned everything, even when life was taking away her last strength. When the doctors diagnosed her, she was immediately convinced that I knew about the will, about the bills, about the documentary subtleties, which I was afraid to even look at the age of 14. "This way, you will always have a home," she told me one day. Her voice remained even, calm, almost impassive, although I could see how difficult it was for her. I didn't realize then how much those words would change my life. My parents' marriage lasted 10 years before my father decided that he needed a new life, a new wife, a new child. I was 9 when he packed his bags. Everything happened without quarrels, without loud accusations and a custody battle. He just left. The only thing he agreed to was to pay for my tuition by creating a special account and transferring the entire amount there in advance, as if paying all the alimony at once, which no one demanded from him. It seemed important to him to make sure he did the right thing by leaving my mom and me. He got married again pretty quickly. His new wife, Linda, gave birth to his daughter, and soon he had a new family in which there was no place for me. I sometimes visited them, staying in their small rented house, but I never felt comfortable there. Linda was constantly busy with my stepsister, enthusiastically listing her successes, then carefully styling her hair. My father was absorbed in his work, claiming that he had to provide for the family, although, apparently, by family, he meant only the 3 of them. "Carol, would you like to join us for dinner?" Linda asked, but her tone betrayed the hope that I would refuse. We maintained friendly relations, at least to the extent possible: greeting cards, rare holiday calls, awkward family dinners at which everyone tried to be extremely polite, but this only made it worse. Mom earned good money as a senior accountant, so when she was diagnosed, she was able to fully focus on treatment. I was 14 when she found out about her illness, and she quit her job the same day, deciding that the main thing now was to fight. For 4 years we lived between hospital rooms and home, between procedures and hope, between fear and feigned calm. Mom never complained. She continued to follow her plan, continued to think ahead, continued to take care of me, but cancer does not recognize any plans or calculations. He doesn't care how prepared you are. I was 18 when she died, just a few weeks before I was supposed to leave for college. I was so overwhelmed by grief that I could barely function, and that's when my father surprised me. He really came to the rescue, showing concern for the first time in a long time. Linda and my stepsister moved in with me for a few months, ostensibly to help me get over the loss, and I was too broken to resist it, too grateful for any support I could get. "We can help you get through this," my father said, gently putting his arm around my shoulders, and Linda nodded, trying to look sympathetic. I didn't know what to do. College was starting in a few weeks, and I had neither the energy nor the desire to think about the future. The house that now officially belonged to me was too full of Mom's memories for me to easily let it go, but leaving it empty for 4 years didn't seem like a good solution either. That's when Dad made his suggestion at breakfast, in one of those morning meetings in the kitchen that had gradually become a habit over the past 2 months that they had been living in my house. He carefully pushed aside his mug of cooling coffee, lingering at me for a moment, as if considering where best to start, and then, gathering his courage, he spoke. "Carol," his voice sounded steady, confident, without a shadow of doubt, as if he had already made a decision for me, just felt it necessary to voice it out loud. "I thought that if we stayed here, we would pay all the bills, maintain this place, you wouldn't have to worry about anything while you're at school." I involuntarily shifted my gaze to Linda, who was standing at the stove, deftly turning pancakes in a pan. When she heard her husband's words, she turned to me, her face lit up with a soft smile, but there was something in her eyes that I couldn't immediately understand, some kind of elusive shadow that quickly dissolved into the usual benevolence. "That would be good for all of us," she added, turning her attention back to breakfast. "Sophie is already enrolled in a local school, and the house will be well taken care of." It made sense. In the last 2 months that they had been living here, everything had turned out surprisingly smoothly. Linda no longer seemed as aloof as she had in my childhood memories, when she kept her distance, as if she wasn't sure what place I should occupy in their lives. Now she seemed genuinely interested in us getting along, sometimes even inviting me to join her for walks or inviting me to dinner at her friend's house if Sophie and I were alone at home. Sophie has changed too. She no longer looked at me like a rare guest who appeared every few months, but treated me like a real older sister. She asked for advice, shared secrets, showed her school drawings. I agreed. Looking back, it seemed to me that this was the perfect solution. I packed up my mom's personal belongings, carefully putting aside the ones I wanted to keep for myself, and hid the rest in the attic, deciding that I would deal with it later. At the end of August, I left for college, confident that I was doing the right thing. The next 4 years flew by almost unnoticed. I came home for vacations, for summer breaks, and every visit brought me real pleasure. Linda always welcomed me with open arms and a table set, trying to please my tastes. "I made your favorite lasagna," she would say, as if she always knew exactly what I liked. Sophie enthusiastically pulled me into her room to show me her new drawings or share the latest school news. The Christmas holidays were filled with cozy bustle. We were decorating the Christmas tree in the living room together, and Dad was lifting Sophie up so she could put a star on top, while Linda and I were good-naturedly arguing about whether it was tasteless. We were sitting by the fireplace with cups of hot chocolate, and at such moments it almost seemed to me that this was my real family, my native, familiar, warm harbor. Summer brought a different atmosphere. More sun, more freedom, more long carefree days. Sophie and I spent time by the communal pool. I helped her with her summer reading, and Linda invited me to meetings of her book club. These meetings turned out to be surprisingly fun. We enthusiastically analyzed the romance novels selected for discussion, and sometimes I found myself thinking that I really enjoyed spending time with her. "Your sister is so good with Sophie," I overheard Linda telling Dad one day. Her voice sounded sincere, and those words sent a pleasant warmth inside me. It's great to have her at home. I felt like I was finally a part of something real, something important. Even when I was far away, this connection was not lost. I called regularly, talked to my dad about my studies, caught up with Linda talking about home, how the roses I planted were blooming, and Sophie and I spent long evenings FaceTime discussing her school adventures. Everything seemed perfect. We built this strange but functional family based on my mother's house, but I think that's the essence of houses. No matter how solid their foundations are, you never know what's going on behind the walls. Now, at the age of 22, with a diploma in my hands and a job offer, I was ready for a new chapter in my life. Marshall & Brooks Financial, a reputable company based in my hometown, interviewed me on Zoom and immediately made me an offer. Everything was falling into place perfectly. Or at least that's what it seemed to me. The taxi driver dropped me off in front of my house on a sunny June day, and before I got closer, I paused at the gate for a moment, allowing myself to just stand and admire this familiar, native place, which for 4 years seemed to me something far away, like a world from the past that existed separately from the life that I lived in college. The rose bushes that my mother had planted were in full bloom, although now they looked a little different than I remembered them. The bushes were more lush. Some branches did not grow as smoothly as when my mother took care of them, but, nevertheless, they still bloomed, flooding the air with their sweet fragrance. The lawn was neatly trimmed, although the grass seemed a little lighter than before, and new curtains appeared on the windows, light, snow-white, with a simple pattern that had not been there before. Small details, barely noticeable changes that had occurred during my absence, but they made me feel a strange, subtle anxiety, which I immediately tried to banish, convincing myself that it was just the excitement of returning home. Picking up my suitcases and slowly moving along the path leading to the front door, I mentally imagined how I would wash, change into something light, and finally be able to stretch out on my old bed, feeling the familiar comfort of my childhood. However, when I inserted the key into the lock and tried to turn it, I was perplexed. The lock wouldn't budge. I tried again, and then again, but to no avail. What the hell? I muttered, wincing in annoyance. Maybe I was just tired from the trip and didn't insert the key correctly. But no, the key definitely didn't fit. I knocked on the door, hesitantly at first, and then harder, feeling the tension build. It was already well past noon, so they should definitely be at home, probably just watching TV or cooking dinner. A few moments later, the door opened and Linda appeared in front of me. Her eyes widened in surprise, and there were flour stains on the aprons she wore over her casual clothes. There were still traces of dough in her hands, and it was obvious that she was baking something homely, cozy, as if I had interrupted them in the middle of an ordinary family day. "Carol?" Her voice sounded strained, too strained for a simple greeting. "What are you doing here?" I rolled my suitcase inside, expecting to be greeted, but instead I noticed my father and Sophie in the living room. They were sitting there, caught off guard by my unexpected appearance. Dad, who was sitting in his favorite armchair, which once belonged to Mom, was holding a tablet in his hands, and Sophie was sprawled on the couch, buried in her phone, but when she saw me, she hurriedly put it aside. "What do you mean?" I asked, not understanding why I was being greeted as if I were an uninvited guest. "I live here." I looked around, noting minor but still noticeable changes in the interior: new cushions on the sofa, another painting above the fireplace, a feeling of slight but elusive alienness, as if someone was slowly but surely erasing those traces of the past that made this house mine. "Why were the locks replaced?" I asked, turning to my father. He awkwardly rubbed his neck, an old habit he always had when he was nervous. "Oh, yes," he said, trying to sound casual, but there was an obvious strain in his voice. "I changed them last month. For safety. You know there have been break-ins in our neighborhood." I nodded slowly, trying to suppress the irritation that was growing by the second. "You could at least tell me that," I said, crossing my arms over my chest. "Or send me a new key. I mean, this is my house." There was a silence, too long, too strained. Linda wiped her hands on her apron, folded them on her chest, and said cautiously, almost reproachfully, "We weren't expecting you." I frowned. "Why not?" "I graduated last week. I told you that I'm coming home to start a new job." I looked around between them, hoping to see some explanation on their faces, but their expressions remained strange, tense. Sophie, who usually eagerly rushed to me with hugs, was now silent, watching the scene with a kind of wary interest. "Carol," Dad finally intervened, getting up, "can we talk in the office for a minute?" I felt something tighten inside me. Office. It was my mother's room. The office where she worked, writing reports, filling out accounting books, planning for the future. Now it was my space, technically, but somehow it seemed to me that its essence had changed a long time ago. I followed my father into the room, where my mother's diploma and awards were still hanging on the wall, and the books on finance that she was proud of were neatly stacked on the shelves. He closed the door behind us, and I noticed that his hands were shaking slightly when he finally turned to me. "Listen, honey," he began softly, avoiding my gaze, "there's something you need to know." I pressed my lips together. "Linda, well, she thinks this house belongs to me." I stared at him, not understanding what he was talking about. "What?" My voice sounded hoarse. "She thinks I gave this house to your mother and you just out of the kindness of my heart after the divorce." He paused, swallowing. "And that after your mom died, he came back to me." My breath caught in my throat. "Does she think she only lived here because you let her?" I felt an icy wave run down my spine. He nodded, and at that moment I realized that all those small changes, the feeling of strangeness, the replacement of locks, all this was not an accident. It was someone's plan. A plan that they have already begun to implement. I must have stood there gaping for a full minute, just trying to process what I'd heard, before I finally found my voice. My head was buzzing, my thoughts were racing erratically, and my first, most natural instinct was to fly out of the office and immediately tell Linda the whole truth, explain to her that the house she had lived in all these years actually belonged to me, that there was no goodwill on my father's part. It couldn't be that this house was the only thing my mom had left me, and that I wasn't the uninvited guest she obviously thought I was. Now I understood her surprised look when she opened the door to me, her tension at dinner, the strange aloofness that replaced the friendly warmth with which she had treated me before. In her mind, I was just an outsider, a person who, without warning, intruded into their measured, orderly life, a freeloader who returned to demand what she no longer thought belonged to me. I moved to the door, intending to figure things out, but the moment my hand went to the handle, Dad grabbed my wrist. "Please, Carol," his voice was barely above a whisper, and there was something pleading in it, something I'd never heard in his tone before. "Just give me some time." I whirled around, peering into his face, at those familiar features that suddenly seemed alien to me. The time? For what? I hissed, feeling rage rise in my throat. "I'll find us a new place to live, I promise," he continued hurriedly, as if he was afraid I wouldn't listen to him. "I just need to figure out how to tell her without ruining our marriage." I stared at him in disbelief. "Ruining your marriage?" I repeated with a venomous laugh. "What about what you're doing to me?" He looked away for a second, then pulled a bunch of keys out of his pocket and handed them to me, as if it were something that could make up for the situation. "It's for the new locks," he said, as if that would somehow fix what was happening. "Please, honey. Just a few weeks. That's all I'm asking. Let me handle this in my own way." I took the keys, feeling nausea rise in my throat. "Okay," I finally managed, resisting the urge to just turn around and leave. "But this is crazy, Dad. You know that, right?" He nodded slowly, relief flashing in his eyes. "Thanks, honey," he murmured. "I'll fix it, I promise." But everything immediately went downhill. At dinner that night, the atmosphere was tense, like a taut string ready to snap at the slightest touch. Linda continued to give me short, appraising glances across the table, her former warmth gone without a trace, as if it had never existed. The woman who once baked my favorite cookies and invited me to her book club now looked at me as if I were a stranger who had accidentally wandered into her house. "More potatoes?" Sophie asked carelessly, oblivious to the tension in the air. "Would anyone mind if I redo the living room?" Linda said suddenly, without looking at me. I froze, gripping my fork tighter. "The current situation is a bit outdated," she added casually. I knew what she was talking about. About Mom's living room. About the arrangement of the furniture that my mother thought over to the smallest detail, about the paintings that she had chosen over the years, about the shelves with books that were more valuable to her than any trinkets. Dad coughed awkwardly, clearly feeling that the situation was getting dangerous, and hurriedly changed the subject. The next morning, while I was making coffee, Linda cornered me in the kitchen. She was still in her bathrobe, her hair was disheveled, but there was no trace of sleepiness in her eyes. They were sharp, focused, penetrating. "Carol," she began, leaning against the counter, "I think we need to talk about your plans." "My plans?" I asked, trying to keep my voice level. "Yes," she said in a light, almost casual tone, as if discussing the weather forecast. "When do you plan to look for your own place?" I sipped my coffee slowly, mentally counting to 10, trying not to give in to the anger that flared up in my chest. "Actually," I said after a pause, "I talked to Dad about staying here for now. He's happy with that." I didn't miss the way Linda's lips tightened into a thin line, the way the muscles in her face tightened. I expected an argument, harsh words, but instead she just turned around and left the kitchen, leaving me alone with a cooling coffee and a growing sense of anxiety. The next 2 weeks were torture. Living in a house that was once my refuge turned into living in a hostile environment where my every action was perceived as an invasion. Linda's attitude changed. At first it was just cold, but then it became openly passive-aggressive. She accidentally washed my clothes along with the colored things that were fading, and then apologized with a shrug. "I just forgot which laundry basket is yours." She cooked family dinners, but by chance, there was always enough food for exactly 3 people, and when I entered the dining room, she opened her eyes wide and said, "Oh, Carol, I completely forgot that you were here too. I'm just used to cooking for the 3 of us." She filled the house with herself. The small changes became more and more obvious. New photos of their family appeared, just her, Dad, and Sophie. Mom's old plaid had disappeared from the couch, and her favorite vase had been replaced by something impersonal. But the worst part was that my father didn't do anything. I saw how he avoided conflict, how he tried not to interfere, and that hurt me the most. I felt like I was being squeezed out of my own home. The house was empty. I stood in the center of the living room, looking around, feeling a strange, oppressive silence that was too much, perfect. The air seemed stagnant, as if no one had breathed in here for a long time, and this was especially strange after weeks full of strained conversations. The muffled sounds of footsteps behind the wall, and the weight of someone's presence, felt even when I was alone. I returned to the kitchen, reflexively poured myself a cup of coffee, but as I brought it to my mouth, I realized that I couldn't taste it, just a bitter aftertaste of anxiety slowly spreading through my body. "Where are they?" I went upstairs again, looking into the rooms. Sophie's room looked untouched. The bed was neatly made, and things were in their proper places, but her makeup and combs, which were always in a mess, were missing from the dresser. Linda's closet, which I could see through the slightly ajar door of their bedroom, looked empty. No robes, no neatly hung dresses. My heart started beating faster. I grabbed my phone from my bedside table, unlocked it, checking my messages, but there was nothing, no missed calls, no notifications, not even a short note on the kitchen table. All that remained of my father and his new family were the neatly arranged furniture, the empty hallway, and the oppressive silence. I went downstairs, trying to ignore the trembling in my hands, and went to the door, but before I picked up the handle, I noticed an envelope left on the table by the entrance. It was perfectly flat, with my name written in my father's familiar handwriting. I sat down on the nearest chair, tore open the envelope, unfolded the folded piece of paper, and froze as I began to read. "Carol, I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you personally, but I just didn't know how. We left. Linda doesn't feel comfortable in this house anymore, and I can't ask her to stay. I found an apartment and we decided to move in. I'm really sorry that everything turned out this way. I hope you'll understand. Dad." I reread the note several times, but the meaning did not change, the words did not disappear, did not add up to something more logical, something that I could accept. They're gone. Just like that. Without warning, without talking, without trying to explain. My heart sank when I realized the depth of what was happening. They didn't just leave, they left me. I stood up slowly, feeling the cold slowly creep over my body. At one point, I thought they were trying to oust me from my own home, but now I saw it differently. I'm the one who pushed them out. I went to the window, looked out at the empty driveway, at the garden, which until recently seemed strange to me, but now, without their presence, became mine again. This house has always been mine. I just forgot about it. I stared at the dark screen of my phone, listening to the dull silence that reigned after Linda dropped the call, and for a while I just sat motionless, as if paralyzed, as if my mind refused to comprehend what had just happened. My fingers were gripping the phone so tightly that my joints turned white, but I didn't even notice it, Her words were throbbing in my head, penetrating my skin, settling in my chest like an icy weight. You were just a burden. You're squatting in our house. When we get back, I want you to leave. Every word echoed painfully inside, driving into a stupor, making reality viscous and unreal, like a bad dream from which it is impossible to wake up. I swallowed, feeling my throat constrict, as tension grew in my chest, turning into a heavy lump that could not be swallowed or exhaled. I closed my eyes, took a deep breath, trying to pull myself together, but it only made it worse. The picture came back to my mind. My father, who didn't say a word when Linda hissed her poisonous, "You're not our problem anymore," into the phone. Sophie, who giggled in the background, as if all this it was some kind of joke, their carefree voices coming over the noise of the sea and tropical music, as if they had simply erased me from their lives, like an unnecessary entry in a phone book. I opened my eyes, feeling everything churning inside, my heart pounding, but with it came a strange realization I had nothing more to lose. They're gone. They left me. They erased me from their lives, but the worst part was that my father did nothing to stop it. I stood up abruptly, throwing my phone on the table, feeling adrenaline rush through me, anger spreading through my body, burning, bright, so pure that it drove away all other emotions, filling the void. Okay. Did they want me to leave? Did they think they could just get rid of me, throw me away like an unnecessary thing? We'll see. I turned around and headed for the hallway, taking quick steps up the stairs, not giving myself time to doubt. My head was empty, my thoughts didn't have time to take shape, but my body moved on its own. I entered my room, jerked open the closet and took out a suitcase, which I didn't even have time to fully disassemble after moving in. I tore my clothes off the shelves, shoved my laptop inside, a box of Mom's jewelry that I brought from the attic a few days ago, stuffed a couple of books that hadn't been thrown away yet, and slammed the suitcase shut, dragging it to the door. I didn't know where I was going. I didn't know what would happen next. But I knew one thing: I wasn't going to leave empty-handed. I returned to my office, Mom's office, and opened the top drawer of my desk, taking out a folder with documents. Certificate of ownership. Mom's will. All the papers that proved that this house belonged to me. I made copies. I took a picture of them on my phone. Let them try to throw me out. I'll see who gets kicked out. I stood on the threshold of the house, feeling a wave of disgust and rage rise inside me, looking at Linda, who just a few seconds ago was shouting, threatening, accusing, and now suddenly changed her tone, trying to smile, as if nothing had happened, as if her poisonous words to me on the phone, you could just take and erase it as an unsuccessful entry. "Oh, Carol, honey," she stammered, putting on a forced smile in which there was not a drop of sincerity. "You didn't think I was serious, did you?" "God, I was just kidding. You know how I can be. Sometimes I say stupid things and then I regret it." I didn't answer. All this sunshine, tropical cocktails, probably went to my head, she continued, trying to laugh, but the laughter came out strained, intermittent. "Let's not make a drama out of this, okay? We're a family." I stared at her without blinking, as if there was a strange, unfamiliar person in front of me whom I hadn't noticed before. "Do you remember how good we were together?" Linda took a step forward, trying to put into her voice the old friendly warmth she used to greet me with when she returned from college. "Our book clubs, Christmas dinners, family evenings, we can bring it back. We don't need to quarrel over some misunderstanding." I felt something snap in my chest. Misunderstandings? I repeated slowly, and my voice was so steady that it seemed to alarm her more than if I had screamed. "Well, yes," she said uncertainly. Her smile became a little less confident. Her eyes darted to her father, but he was still silent, looking away, as if he wanted to sink into the ground. I took a step back, removing the hand she was trying to touch my shoulder with. "Are you saying that you were just joking?" I continued, feeling an icy rage constrict me from the inside out, displacing any emotions. That those words you hissed into the phone were just a joke? Linda opened her mouth, but I didn't let her finish. You called me a freeloader. She said that my father had never loved me. She said that I was just a burden that was being tolerated out of pity, and that you didn't intend to do it anymore. I paused, looking her straight in the eye, giving her the opportunity to feel at least a little of the poison that she poured into me without hesitation 2 weeks ago. You told me to get out of my own house. Her face contorted for a moment, but then she quickly regained her mask of a good-natured hostess who just wants to settle a small family dispute. Carol, come on, she drawled. I was angry. I went too far, but that doesn't mean I really think so. Get out. She froze. What? Get out. Right now. I took a step forward, clutching the new keys in my fist. This house is not yours, Linda. It never belonged to you. You lived here because I let you. Now I won't let you. Linda turned pale, her lips twitched, but then they tightened into a thin line, and I saw the mask finally slip off her face. Are you serious? Stop it, she hissed. After all I've done for you? I laughed, but there was no joy in it. For me? You haven't done anything for me, Linda. You just tolerated me as long as it was beneficial to you. And now your time is up. I turned to my father, who still hadn't said a word, hunched over by the car, avoiding my gaze. You too, Dad, I said in a flat voice. Take your things and leave. He looked up, his face tired but not surprised. Carol. Don't, I snapped. You had time to say something. You chose silence. Linda flushed. You can't just kick us out. I slowly took the documents out of my pocket. I can. And I've already done it. Sophie, who had been standing off to the side all this time, took a step closer, but when I looked at her, she immediately retreated. Linda's eyes flashed angrily, but I could see that she had already lost. You're going to regret this, she said, grabbing her suitcase. No, Linda, I opened the door, looking at her calmly. You're going to regret this. She took a step towards me, holding out her arms as if she were going to hug me, but I didn't move, didn't take a single step towards her, just stood with my arms crossed over my chest, watching her, as one watches an actress on stage who has already played her role, but does not want to leave the stage. Dad jumped up, and his voice, usually calm and balanced, was now trembling with emotions that, perhaps for the first time in a long time, he could not control. Princess, I'm so sorry, he began, looking at me as if he hoped that I, as in childhood, would melt away from his affectionate nickname, that I would forget everything that was said and just let them come back into my life. I know I handled it wrong, but I love you, you're my daughter, please, can't we work this out? I looked at him. I really looked at it. In front of me stood the man who abandoned me when I was 9, the man who paid for my education but was not present in my life, who lied about my house, my inheritance, my mother's inheritance, the man who allowed his wife to expel me from my own home and did not even try to do so. Prevent it. What is it, Dad? My voice sounded flat, almost cold. The fact that you lied to your wife about owning my house? Or the fact that you were standing next to her when she was planning to throw me out of it? Linda turned to me with that tight smile of hers, which now had not even a trace of sincerity left. Carol, let's be reasonable, she said, her voice softening, as if she were trying to play the caring stepmother role again. We can all live here together. We'll pay the rent. No, I said firmly, not letting her finish. We can't. I met her gaze without hesitation, seeing the irritation flicker in it, the anger light up in her eyes when she realizes she won't be able to persuade me. Your things are in the garage, I continued, feeling a growing sense of final, irrevocable confidence. Take them and leave. Linda's mask cracked. You ungrateful little. She hissed, but I didn't let her finish. After all we've done for you," she continued, no longer trying to hide her rage. "You just spent $10,000 on a luxury vacation that you deliberately hid from me," I reminded her, crossing my arms over my chest. "I'm pretty sure you can afford an apartment." Dad tried to grab my hand again. "Carol, please. I know I screwed up, but—" "No," I interrupted, taking a step back. "You lied. 4 years old." He froze, and I saw the pain flash in his eyes, but it didn't bother me anymore. "You let your wife believe that she owns my mother's house," I continued, looking straight into his face. "You saw how she tried to redo it, rearrange it, erase all traces of her mother. And when she was going to kick me out, you didn't say anything." "I was going to tell her the truth," he muttered, but there was no certainty in his voice. "When, Dad?" I shook my head. When would she finish remodeling my house for herself? When I would have nowhere to go? He looked away, and I took the last step toward the door. "I'm done," I said, feeling an invisible weight finally lift from my shoulders. "Take your things and get out." I entered the house and closed the door, ignoring Linda's screams, as she knocked on the window, shouting accusations of my ingratitude and cruelty. I stood in the hallway with my back against the door, listening to the clatter of suitcases outside, the slamming of the rental car door, and my father trying to reach me one last time. I didn't open it. I watched from the window as they loaded the boxes, as Sophie stealthily wiped away her tears, as Linda was still screaming, and my father looked hunched over, depressed, as if he had just realized what he had lost. It took them 3 approaches to pick up all the things, 3 attempts before they finally left. When their car disappeared around the corner, I slowly inhaled and exhaled, and then turned around and walked through the house. The next day, Dad tried to call from a new number. "Carol, please," his voice begged. "We can fix this." "No, Dad," I said calmly. "We can't." "Linda made it very clear that you all really think of me," I interrupted him. He paused. "A freeloader. A burden. The person you've never loved." "Carol," those were her words, not mine. "But your silence has said enough." I pressed the call reset button, blocked the number, and put the phone aside. That was 2 months ago. I'm still living in my mom's house right now. My house. I repainted the walls, threw out Linda's old curtains, and removed the faceless knickknacks she was trying to replace Mom's things with. I planted new roses in the garden, returned the vase to its place on the mantelpiece, and made this house my own again. Sometimes I think about them. I wonder where they ended up, how Linda is coping with the rent, if Sophie is okay, if my father is trying to establish a relationship with her the same way he once did with me. But mostly I think about my mom. About how she made sure that I always had a home, that I always had a place where I couldn't be betrayed, where I couldn't be crossed out. It doesn't matter that Dad still tries to call from different numbers sometimes. I'm not picking up the phone anymore. Some bridges that were once burned should remain ashes. The irony is that I'm happier now than I've been in recent years. My work is going well. I've made new friends. And for the first time since my mother died, I feel at peace in this house. Sometimes healing means letting go. To let people go. Let go of the lie. Let go of the fairy tales about the family you wanted to believe in.